there's a lot of grief. You can't go through such a
Sure.
change without grieving for what you thought you were going to, the
Yeah.
life you thought you were going to have, grieving how the obstacles, what comes along, grieving the impact on other people. But then there's also the hope.
Welcome to Sensitive Stories. This episode is for educational purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for treatment with a mental health or medical professional. Let's dive in. So, Melissa, in your book, Late Bloomer, you talk about how you accidentally discovered that you're highly sensitive. And I'm,
Yes.
I'm curious to hear more about that.
It actually was very much on accident. My partner and I went to a yoga retreat center where they do educational classes, and she had signed us up for something that was meaningful to her,
Mm.
and wanted to be supportive, and went ahead. I had prepared. It wasn't a class I would have selected for myself. And so I wanted to kind of go in because I do like to be prepared, typically. Never really thought about why. It's just something I knew about myself that, oh,
Mhm.
I should prepare. And again, so many things I would do, never even thought about it, just did it.
Mhm.
And we show up in this beautiful place in Western Massachusetts in what turns out to be a very small classroom, hard chairs, and this topic that's very foreign to me. I don't have a huge investment in it. And one of the first things after the instructor does her initial introduction is break up into small groups. And I'm like, oh, how I
The
dread that.
worst.
I just dread that, really. So I kind of, I muddle through a little bit, and I get through. The first night is a short one, and I get through. And the next morning, my partner and I have a small little, not a great exchange,
Mhm.
having to do with some family stuff. But it was just enough that I was like, okay, so I
Mhm.
wasn't embracing this anymore. I was already uncomfortable. We go back to this small little classroom, and I'm just not feeling it now.
Yeah.
And, so I'm like, feels like it's closing in on me. And
Mhm.
it just feels like now it was going to be a longer day. And I'm like,
Yes.
I don't think I can do this. Like, I'm listening to my body. My body's just getting really
Yeah.
uncomfortable. And I'm envisioning myself in this small space with these people and this topic. I'm already upset. And I just feel something brewing inside of me that says, this is not going to work for me.
Mhm.
And I decide to leave, which is a
Mm.
little out of character for me because it's
Yeah.
like, sweat it out. Don't, I work really hard not to be embarrassed. I didn't want
Right.
her to be any more upset, but I knew I just couldn't spend the whole day there. And
Mhm.
so I picked up and I was like, you know what? It's a beautiful day. I'm going to go outside. I'm going to take care of me. Maybe I'll come back later. Right.
Mm.
Because beautiful campus. So as I'm walking out, I pass what would be a larger room with a little index card with a couple of interesting questions like, do you have, whatever it was, these crazy dreams? I'm like, oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have a wild inner life? Yeah. And I'm like, what is this? Everything except my name was on that index card.
Right. You saw
So
yourself.
I sneak in, I hide in the corner, huge room as opposed to where I had just come from, people everywhere. They're not just sitting in chairs. Some are in chairs, some are on the floor, some are lying down. I'm
Yeah.
like, what is going on? I've never seen anything like this. I've, never been in a workshop like this. And I'm listening to the person speak who I didn't know who she was, but everything she says resonates for me.
Yeah.
And it's almost like a This Is Your Life or a candid camera. And I'm like looking around, like,
Right.
was this a setup? Like, this is really
Right.
weird. Like, you're talking to me and I'm not even supposed to be here. And on the first break, I go up to the person who is helping. It turns out to be Dr. Elaine Aaron,
I
who
I thought
is the
so.
guru of
Yes.
highly sensitive people. and her partner in instructing was Dr. Elaine Friend.
Yep.
And I go up
I
to her and I'm like, kind of like, what is this all about? I just got here. And she opens up her computer. She shares the slides with me. And all of it, it's like angels singing all of a sudden, like the light, like Wizard of Oz, black and white to color. It's like all of a sudden, everything is like falling into place. You didn't even know it was out of place,
right.
but everything starts tumbling in. And I look at her and I go, how could I not have known
Hmm.
about this? And she just looked at me and she says, you've been too busy surviving.
Mm.
And it made so much sense.
Yes.
It didn't. It's like, but it all fell into place. And that was it. I was done. I stayed. I soaked it up. I wanted to learn everything. I wanted to know everything. I was so excited. I like
Hmm.
bounced back into the room later on when my partner was still like, you left and I haven't heard from you all day. You left the workshop. I'm like, I forgot about that. I was so excited.
Sure.
But she saw how excited I was. And I'm like, I understand myself. I'm like, look, there's
Wow.
a name. It was so validating. It was so
Wow.
validating for me. And it was all accidental. I wasn't supposed to be, well, technically, I wasn't
Right.
supposed to be there, but I was.
Wow.
Uh,
What a profound discovery story.
Game changer.
Game
It was
changer.
a game
And
changer.
you had this visceral reaction and pulling you out of that space and then just serendipitously finding Dr. Elaine Aaron's workshop. Were you at Kripalu?
Yes.
I thought
Yes.
so. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I was
um,
active. Yeah.
magical things happen there.
Unbelievable.
Yes.
Absolutely unbelievable, but
Unbelievable.
definitely a game changer.
Yes.
Because all of a sudden I had language,
Right.
right?
Yes.
So, I have all these things about me. If I go to a work conference, I know that I'm going to get early and I'm going to set up my seat because I'm going to want to be on the end. I
Yep.
might take up the seat next to me. I mean, if it gets really crowded and nobody can sit, I'll take my stuff off. But, if there's
Mhm.
available seats, I'm going to want that empty. I'm going to want to
Definitely.
be towards the back. So if I have to get
Hmm.
up and leave, I know these things about me, they're routine, but I never stop to think about, well, why do I do that? Why
Mm.
do I not want to have lunch with everybody? Why do I say
Right.
no? Why do I extend my hotel stay? Why do I
Hmm.
need that? Why do I feel bad when people say you're extending your hotel stay? Well, don't you miss your family? And like, well, yeah, no, I guess I should. But, and I didn't really think about it.
Yeah.
Suddenly, I had language. And
Yes.
now I was able to kind of go back over all these things I knew I did without ever wondering why or questioning.
So you were already doing a lot of these things before you had the context.
Absolutely. I've always been
Yes, but
doing these
didn't know
things.
why.
Didn't know why.
What,
Yeah.
yeah. What changes now that you know? Or does anything change? Obviously, you're probably still doing those things, but has anything shifted having the context, the language?
It makes sense to me now.
Yeah.
So I still do those things,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't feel like looking around going, am I the only one doing it? Oh, no, no, they're here early too. Or is this odd?
Yeah.
Or, I don't, I do it because I understand why I do it now. And I understand that there are people like me that do it also.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not, maybe I am the odd duck or I'm not the odd duck, but it doesn't really matter.
Mm.
It's okay.
Mm-hmm.
However somebody wants to label it,
Right.
it's okay because it's just who I am.
Right.
When there was a
Exactly.
time, like especially if you're a kid, nobody wants to be the odd duck. Nobody
Mm-mm.
wants to be the weird one. And you kind of get that sense that you are. I always did. And until I found my HSP people,
Yeah.
and started like hearing other people say things that they had had the same experience. They felt odd. They felt almost like an alien. They would do these things. Very validating when you think
Mm-hmm.
you're the only one.
It
You're not.
is. Yeah, to have community, so important.
Yes.
And to
Yes.
have language, to put your experiences into a framework, to know,
Mm.
oh, and this is why I do these things. There's a deeper understanding about yourself.
Yes. Yeah. The
Yeah.
language is key, in my
Yes.
opinion. The
Mm-hmm.
language is key because we can know we do these things, we think about it, we don't think about it. But when you can language it, when you can, kind of, for those people that are interested or want to hear, or if you just have a need to say, even if it's kind of like off the cuff, don't mind me. I'm highly sensitive. I kind of need to be here, you
Yeah.
know, make a joke about it. Or
Yeah.
somebody might be interested. And then you can say, hey, by the way, I found this neat thing about myself.
Yeah.
And it's, 100 other species have it. And, they
Mm-hmm.
say they need people like us. You guys need people like us,
Exactly.
depending who you're talking to.
Mm-hmm.
But having that language
Mm-hmm.
is critical. At least it was for me.
It is critical to have the context, and I appreciate how you're saying you can make it lighthearted. It doesn't have to be a big issue. Oh, I happen to sit on the end. I need to sit in the back. I need some buffer time. I'm going to stay an extra night in the hotel after a conference or a training,
Yeah.
and to recharge or to have just a transitional period. That can be okay. It's different. And some
Hmm.
other people might need to run home to their kids. It's not that you don't care and love about your kids. It's more, feeling overwhelmed. I'm putting words into your mouth. But I assume just needing that buffer time.
Absolutely. Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And looking back, I know that now. So
Yeah.
my body was intuitively doing, and this is what I always found interesting. My body was doing things um, kind of on its own. I was just sort of following along. And while I am a person who thinks about everything, there are clearly some things I didn't think about. I just sort of marched to it.
Mm-hmm.
And I always, since making this discovery, found it interesting that my body knew what it needed and I followed along. I
Yeah.
wasn't kicking and screaming about it. I may not have understood it, but I also wasn't really thinking about it. Now I can put it together. And I've now, since making the discovery, keep looking back through a new lens.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting to revisit your own life and
Yeah.
look at things. It's kind of like, you're standing on a spiral staircase and you can see everything. You can see where you've been. You can kind
Yeah.
of see where you're going.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't really like spiral staircases. I get dizzy, but this is the great metaphor is that you keep looking back through
Right.
a different lens.
Right. Every
And
step.
yeah, and you look back
Mm-hmm.
and from where you are now, those steps are still there. Those events are still there. Those didn't change, but now I can understand it differently, put new meaning to it, have a
Mm-hmm.
different lens through which to look at it.
Yeah.
And that's something that I do repeatedly. So,
Mm-hmm.
it's like reading a good book over and over, or I like watching a good movie over and over. I'm going to hit
Right.
replay on a song. I keep looking back over my life over those same stories, but now they
Mm-hmm.
have a different meaning.
Yeah, that's the rich part of discovering you're highly sensitive. Everything has new meaning.
Yeah.
And you're right, at every phase, it's going to look a little differently. I want to go back to something you said. I just knew what I needed. And not everyone is able to listen to that internal call. So I'm curious, what made it possible for you not having the context? What allowed you to listen to your needs before you even knew that you were an HSP, if you have any sense of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because I can't say I did it all of the time, and I'm still
Mm-hmm.
learning. Even though I have the language, it's still new to me. So all of this just happened just before the pandemic.
Very
So
recent then,
this is
within the last five
still
years.
on the newer side for
Wow.
me. And I'm still making connections and I'm still
Mm-hmm.
looking back and learning about things, especially becoming overwhelmed, what overwhelms me. Um, so I can't tell you that I understand why I just always wanted to sit by a door or on the edge. It was just a discomfort with, I don't want to get locked in. What if I do need to
Mm-hmm.
leave? I wanted to have that personal space.
Yeah.
I was the one that didn't go to the large area where everybody was sitting and having lunch. Like you've just spent hours listening to workshops and people talk. And the last thing I wanted to do,
Right.
with no disrespect to my colleagues, was have lunch and talk some more and then do another
Right.
few hours. So
Right.
I would sneak out early. I'd get my little box lunch, so I didn't have to wait online and have to
Mm-hmm.
turn down invitations, sneak to my hotel, my room, which I intentionally asked for a low floor. So I didn't have to
Oh,
take an elevator all the way up. I was conserving time. Like I started doing these
that's
things.
very smart.
without actually like thinking about it. It just seemed to make
Right.
sense to me. Get
Mm-hmm.
out early, get a lower floor. I mean, like things made sense to me, but I didn't stop and turn myself inside out and understand why. It's just
Mm-hmm.
seemed to make sense.
Right. I mean, I've heard a lot of people on the podcast tell me, they just knew something was different about them. They knew they were more of this or that, and they just went along with taking care of that, even before they had the language. Sounds like you did that too. You just know I need to maximize my time. I want to be prepared. I know what I need. Did you
Right.
get a lot of support in your life from your family or friends to honor your needs?
Well, before,
Before, yeah.
yeah, you know, so at the time that I was doing those things, did I get support? It was support in the way that nobody argued with me. Nobody questioned, well, why? You know,
Yeah.
except I do remember that one neighbor that said she did question, don't you miss your family? And
Mm-hmm.
I said, of course, but I'm just taking the night to kind of process, it's a
Right.
big conference, there's a lot of information. I just want to take, a little extra time to process it all.
Yeah,
It's not about not missing or not wanting to be with someone. And,
that's right.
but otherwise, nobody questioned, uh, except for that one person,
I
actually.
love it. Yeah. And it's
Yeah.
true, it's a both end. I want to be with my family, and I also need time to integrate this material before I jump off into the next thing.
Right. But I think I
Yeah.
was using that, not that um, there was just something about being alone in a hotel room, and that was just very comforting. And
It's the
I
best.
the quiet, and I hadn't thought about it then, how much I have always sought
Hmm.
time alone.
Yeah.
So I knew I did. I could tell you that, but I never really made the connection until I started thinking about it afterwards. All of the times, going back to when I was a kid,
Right.
that I would seek out time alone, time in small spaces,
Hmm.
and didn't understand it, but that's been a theme throughout my
Hmm.
life, and still. But now I can language it, and now you have to balance, asking, and for solitude is not always the easiest thing.
Yeah, it's not always easy, and folks that don't need it don't understand it.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. That's a
What
bit
is it?
challenging.
It is challenging to, because when you don't have that lived experience, that need for small solitary spaces, it's hard to really let someone in. I always think like if I wish I could take what I'm feeling and put it in someone else so they could really
Yes,
understand it, because it's
yes,
hard to put it into words. Um,
yes.
I'm curious, as you're discovering that you're highly sensitive, and you discover that later in life, you talk about that in your book, Late Bloomer. What else did you discover later in life?
Well, the biggest thing I discovered, I put them, they're both about the same. Discovering I'm
Mm,
HSP, which came afterwards, it was just as big for me in my life as discovering that I have a same-sex attraction.
mm-hmm.
That came later in life as well.
Yeah.
And that's the premise of the book that I wrote, was to tell my story
Mm-hmm.
about that. But peppered through the book is also some of these reactions and things that were out of character, which all lead up to my discovering that I'm highly sensitive. So all of
Yeah.
that then makes sense to me. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
because at the time, people would be like, didn't you see this coming? Or how could you not have known?
Yeah.
And and my reactions to some people seemed bigger than, I mean, people want to either judge, criticize, or qualify what things should be, as
Right.
opposed to, it is what it is for everybody and everybody's
Yeah.
experience. Whatever you bring to that table, that experience is it.
Mm-hmm.
And then again, it made sense later. So I found out when I was 44, I made this discovery that, and I was married to a man.
Mm-hmm.
We had the whole house in the suburbs, the two kids.
Mm-hmm.
This is the life that I
Right.
was preparing for my
Mm-hmm.
whole life. Um, And when I was 44, I asked myself the question for the first time ever. And people find that hard to believe. I had never asked a question before. And I asked if I was gay. I asked myself. And
Mm-hmm.
then I go through this whole journey of trying to answer the question and then come to terms with the answer because the impact
Sure.
on the people that I love, that my life was now changing if I go with
Mhm.
this, if I go in this direction. But what would it look like if I didn't? And
Right. That's a good question too.
so
What
as a
happened?
highly sensitive person, I look at everything and
Yes.
I use the Rubik's cube. I'm constantly turning and
Mm.
twisting and looking at everything. And I had to weigh that, go this direction. What does that look like?
Mm-hmm.
Don't do anything. What does that look like?
Wow. It's a, those are some big questions to ask yourself, especially when the people that you love the most, your kids, your husband at the time, and this is what stops a lot of HSPs from listening to that inner calling, that intuition, that dream, that yearning, however you want to call it, because they're worried about the impact on others. So how did you get through that to listen to yourself?
Yeah. The hard part is at the same time this is happening, you're having this existential crisis, which is never a good time for that. But, at the
Right.
time when you've got a husband, a
Mm-hmm.
job, a career, kids, and important milestones coming up in their lives, you
Right.
can't hit pause. So you're doing, talk about overwhelm, you're doing everything. You're doing a deep dive inside of yourself, and you still need to show up somehow, be present for your patients, for your
Right.
family, for life. Bills still have to get paid. Everything has to get done. And so I kept it to myself for as long as I could
Mm-hmm.
while I went and got help to help me figure it out and while I got to those answers. And what pushed me over at the end was it was both my kids and also when I realized I wasn't able to show up for my husband in the way that he deserved.
Right.
So I could keep all this under wraps, but it's going to ooze out. There's
Mm-hmm.
still going to be something there, and that wasn't fair to anybody.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew that I wanted to be authentic, not just for myself, but I wanted to model that for my kids. And I always said, if my kids, either of them came to me and said, "Hey, mom, can we talk? I've got this like big thing." What would I say to them? And I knew without hesitation, I would tell them, you have to be true to yourself
Mm-hmm.
because it's going to come back to you later and you have to be true. And I
Yeah.
didn't want to be a hypocrite. I didn't want to not model that. And I
Mm-hmm.
just hoped that things would fall into place later. I knew there would be some fallout, um, but I just, hoped that things would fall into place as things went along. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
so,
Yeah, it makes sense to be that model for them. That this is how we live and the importance of authenticity and not denying yourself. Because you're right, I think a lot of times we assume that whether it's setting a boundary or a bigger choice around uprooting your life, that it's better to just stick with the status quo. But really, you're right. That lack of authenticity, it hurts the other people,
yeah,
right? And by
it
you
does.
honoring yourself, you actually are treating them with kindness.
Right. Because otherwise, everything is for show, but
Right.
you can't unknow what you know.
Yeah.
And so it's
Right. You can't put it
going
back in
to,
the box.
you can, you're right. The toothpaste, once it's out of the tube, that's
That's
it. You
right.
cannot put that back in.
Yeah.
And, you know, it gets messy and it is messy and my story is messy and I
Mm-hmm.
left a lot of the mess in intentionally. I didn't want to sugarcoat it.
Yeah.
Um, because I've read other stories, I've heard other stories, and this is a messy journey. But journeys can be messy and life is unpredictable.
Mm-hmm.
It's meant to be, it's supposed to be, and we're supposed to adjust as we go along. And so I left the mess in for that reason, because I
Mm-hmm.
didn't want to sugarcoat and I didn't want to give anybody that was going through this journey or a similar journey of, reevaluating themselves or their lives. I didn't want them to, be misled into
Mm-hmm.
something or think that, well, it was so easy for her. Why am I struggling?
Right.
So I wanted them to see that there was struggle and there were obstacles because that's reality. That's life.
Exactly. That's the truth, you know. And the mess doesn't have to be a negative. Like you're saying, it's just part of the process.
Right.
Don't let
Yes.
it deter you.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And it easier said than done sometimes because it's
Mm-hmm.
hard. But I tell people who reach out to me, I say, it's hard when you know what you know, and you make a decision maybe for somebody else, and it's hard making a change that's going to impact. Choose your heart.
Mm.
Neither one is going to be easy. You get to choose your heart though, and
Yeah.
hopefully at the end of whatever it is that you choose, things will smooth over
Yeah.
and you'll land somewhere. That's the hope. And so I infuse a lot of that in the book, that there's a lot of grief. You can't go through such a
Sure.
change without grieving for what you thought you were going to, the
Yeah.
life you thought you were going to have, grieving how the obstacles, what comes along, grieving the impact on other people. But then there's also the hope.
Mm.
And so I think the two of them, they travel together a lot. And at least for me, it did. For as much grief as I had, I also held on to hope. I
Mm-hmm.
had to.
Well, how did you work with the grief? If you could give us a little snapshot.
It's funny because it took a while before I realized that that's what I was carrying, that that's what I
Right.
was feeling. And the other thing I had put in the book was when I had said life is still going on around you. So things happen. I lost my job. My now ex-husband shifted where we started out very amicable.
Uh-huh.
He
Yeah.
took a different direction,
Sure.
and people get sick and people died. And
Mm-hmm.
that's an understandable grief. So
Right.
it wasn't until I knew when some of these things happened, when somebody that I cared for died, for example, and I'm like, okay, well, that's a socially
Yeah.
condoned grief. You're going to feel sad, you're expected to.
Right.
And I went in to take care of myself, that I realized there was a lot more grief. I was
Yeah.
grieving for a lot, not just this one person.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it took a while because some of these things are invisible. And
Yeah. They really
so that,
are.
yeah,
And we put grief in a box where we think we can only grieve if we've lost a particular person. But you're right, grief shows up in a lot of different ways. Losing part of self, losing the life you thought you were going to have. I've seen a lot of my sensitive clients go through this grief. And also, when you're coming out, when you realize your sexuality is different than you thought it was, especially after 44 years,
yeah,
that's pretty profound grief that comes in. And
absolutely.
lots of change, which HSPs we can struggle with, right? And you
Yes.
went through some pretty catastrophic changes.
Right. So
Yeah.
nobody really likes or embraces change, but it is part
No.
of life. And,
Mm-hmm.
we as in HSPs, but, for sure myself, transition slowly. But life is moving at this pace. And when there's other people involved, you can't stop it. You can't hit pause.
That's right.
And so you're going with it, and just, things are accumulating. Um, so one of the things that I did was I sought that time alone, just to try to let things land a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I reached out for help. I started writing. I started
Mm.
trying to literally get it out of my body and putting it on a paper, something, because that also helped me process and help me make sense of things.
Mm-hmm.
So it was just a way of kind of extracting it, even if it was, just to look at it visually. So that helped.
It does. I think HSPs don't realize the benefit, the value of processing, and that for a lot of us that is writing. It could also be, talking things through, creating other things with your hands. But writing for me too is so profound.
Yeah.
So much gets moved through in that. At the time, were you writing just for yourself, or were you thinking, I'm going to write a book?
No, 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 no. I was never thinking about writing a book,
Okay.
even though um, early on, very early on, when I was first still kind of figuring things out, but I started meeting other people that had had this experience, and we would
Mhm.
share our stories. People would say, "Oh, you should write a book. You should write a book." And I think it's just a common thing, but I never
Mhm.
actually gave serious thought to it. And but what happened during the pandemic when I had time,
Yeah.
I uncovered some of those writings and I'm like, oh,
Mhm.
well, I remember what that felt like. I'm glad I
Yeah.
wrote this down or
Mhm.
things like that. And I decided to continue to write and to organize my thoughts and to process it now that things had slowed down a little bit in my world. Um, and it became a book. Uh, and
Beautiful.
I was working with an editor who said, "This is shaping up into a book." I said, "Oh, well, now what?"
Right.
And and one of my motivations was because it's a very personal story. Um, but one of my motivations was when I was confused, when I had first asked the question of myself.
Yeah.
I went looking for help, whether it was from a person, a therapist, online,
Mhm.
books, and it was challenging to find,
Yeah.
that information.
Mhm.
So I wanted to um, offer something to somebody else that might be going through it. Um,
Yeah.
if they were doing a random search, if they needed to hear my story, if my story resonates in some way, I wanted to be able to put something out there in the hands of somebody who was like me at some point and just needed something, some validation, some resource,
Mhm.
whether it's in my story or people have reached out to me, which I welcome, to ask me.
Yeah.
So,
It's whether or not it, I mean, it's beautiful to have that story representative coming out later in life, making the brave choice to change your life in such a profound way. But then I think it's relatable, at least for me, it's relatable on other levels too, whether you're highly sensitive or whether there's something big that you shifted. Because as sensitive people, we're often late bloomers in lots of different ways, whether that's finding a career, a relationship, yourself,
mhm.
spirituality. There's so many layers there that we often come to later in life, and just being able to say, that's okay, right? It's okay to ask yourself the question and then listen to the answer and go through the mess. I'm curious, what brought you a little bit of hope during those times of grief and discovery and messiness?
Mm. So my hope was just, some people would say I was stubborn. I'd say I was hopeful. I had a dream for a certain kind of life for my kids. And that's what I wanted. And that's what I had hoped for. And that's what I was working on. And discovering that you're gay when you're 40, 44 years old, doesn't work with that dream. So you have
Mhm.
to adjust a little bit. So I said, okay, so this isn't going to be what I thought it was going to be. What more? What can I do? Well, I can have a great relationship with my ex and we can model something for my kids, for our kids. We can be respectful, we can communicate, we can show them in 3D, full color, that this can be okay.
Yeah,
And, things didn't work that way at that time. So you shift again and
right.
you model something else. But so I was holding on to what I really wanted and making subtle adjustments along the way. And in the holding on, that's where the hope
Yeah,
hoping that we can land somewhere. And at the end of the day, it was always about the kids. And I
I love
had to
that.
hold on to hope because it was them that I
Mm-hmm.
was holding on to it for. It was all about them. So I couldn't just
Yeah.
give up because it felt like I'd be giving up on them.
Yeah, you can still get to the same destination, being good role model, support, rock for your kids. It's just gonna look differently along the way. But yeah, that permission to it's okay to readjust, to make a change.
Right. And
Yeah.
it's again, it was messy. If I can go back and do it differently with what I know now, people ask me that. Of course,
Hmm.
of course. But
Sure.
all you can do is what you can do at the time,
That's right.
and then make sense of it later and continue to own it, model it, and hope continue to hope that things still circle. Just it may not
Yeah.
have been how you wanted it or when you wanted it, but things do land. Things have a
Hmm.
tendency to land. This I've learned along the way that they do
Yeah.
land.
I love that. So what does life look like now after the mess?
Life looks interesting. It
Hmm.
really does. So my kids are older than they are, they have landed in good places, and I'm so grateful for that. I'm grateful for their love and their support and how they show up in the world for others, for each other, for me. That sends a message to me,
Hmm.
and so that's really good. And I'm in a relationship with a woman who is committed to continuing to grow.
Hmm.
She has long since forgiven me for walking out of that classroom at Kripalu,
Hmm.
fortunately. And we've learned an awful lot about um, you know, being highly sensitive and what that means. And I appreciate that it's now a learning curve for her,
Hmm.
so a new language, that she also, it's invisible. So
Hmm.
it's not always easy.
Yeah.
And but I appreciate and I'm grateful for her partnership and her support that she wants to show up and she wants to understand.
Yeah.
And so we have um, the kids, we have a little place in Provincetown,
Hmm.
which for me, as a highly sensitive introvert, is my soul place. And I've
Mm-hmm.
learned so much about myself in this small little town, village, if you
Hmm.
will, that's surrounded by nature, surrounded by history, surrounded by art, that, it's like, where have you been all my life? Um, so it's just been an amazing journey because each piece of it, I uncover a little bit more about myself.
Yeah. Yeah, you seem really settled into who you are.
But it's still, it ebbs and flows
Ebbs and
because you
flows,
keep
yeah.
looking back at that spiral staircase
Mm.
and things continue to make sense,
Yeah.
and or you try to have it make sense.
Right.
And those things that you know about yourself now, when I'm in a writing class and a writing group and they go, okay, let's break off into groups, I'm still like, oh, really?
Yeah.
But I understand it now.
Mm-hmm.
I understand more than I did then. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
So that's the good thing is things are still happening, um,
Right.
but I can language it, I can understand it. And I think the key is I am give myself grace. And
Yeah.
I think that's important. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can tell there's a lot of acceptance of what your needs are and honoring your sensitivity. That makes a big difference.
yes, and I've
Mm-hmm.
become an advocate, for those people.
Mm-hmm.
I think we get a really bad rap. Well, introverts get a bad rap. A lot of people who don't know about highly sensitive, but the word sensitivity,
Mm-hmm.
now that I could pay attention, I'm
Yep.
tuned in. In Western society, oh my, do we get a bad rap? And I want to
Yes.
represent. And so
Yes.
it's a coming out of, in a way. And so I will come out, and people have reached back to me. People have reached out to me because I write about it in essays or in the book, and they say,
Mm-hmm.
me too. That's me
Yes.
too.
Exactly.
People want to connect, and I appreciate that. You have to know where your people are.
It's true, you really do. And I've talked about this with a few other HSQs. Brian Torres used this term, HSQ, highly sensitive queers, which I love. That there is some parallels between coming out as LGBTQ plus or coming out as a highly sensitive person because it's not obvious to people.
Right.
or it's not something
Right.
that you're always putting out right into the forefront because of those stigmas,
Mhm.
that
Right.
discrimination. But yeah, you are definitely modeling it, which I appreciate so much.
Right. But they all, it's true that you say that, for somebody like me, um, both of these things can be invisible.
Yeah.
So you're constantly making that choice to come out. When
Yes.
somebody, somebody says, if I say I'm going away somewhere and someone
Mm-hmm.
says, oh, well, will your husband pack his own bag? And I have
Yep.
to make that choice right then and there
Yep.
to come out. And I don't really know this person well or what their reaction is. I'm
Right.
coming out with my sexuality. In another, it might be coming out as an introvert, it might be coming out as highly sensitive,
Mm-hmm.
but it's always, you're always coming out and you're always
Yeah.
having to make that choice. Do I, don't I?
Yep.
How much? What's at stake? Is it worth
Mm-hmm.
it? So it doesn't stop. It's an ongoing process.
Yeah, it really is. Every day, every interaction, like, well, how much do I disclose? How much do I have the energy to disclose, and how safe is it?
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
constant choice. Yeah.
Yes. And are you going to expend that energy? Are they going to understand? Are they going to care? Are you, because we do have to be protective, and this I've learned, protective of our energy.
Absolutely.
And I recognize that now more. And if you're going to invest, and let somebody in, do they really want to be let in? So
Yeah, that's true too.
yeah. So, you
Right.
do have to weigh the pros and cons. Sometimes it's just practice. Sometimes you've educated someone and they've appreciated it. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes people go, yeah, me too. And that's when it really feels good.
Yes, that's the best outcome
Yeah.
when you get to connect with another person who's also sensitive or is also queer. It's like, oh, yes, I'm not alone.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Is there a message you could leave folks with, the listeners who are highly sensitive, who, are having this urge to make a change later in life? Maybe there's an internal calling or an intuition of some sort. What message could you leave them with?
Do it, but do it with grace and patience and forgiveness of yourself. It's not about being perfect. It is a process. But if your body is talking to you, it's talking to you for a reason. And so tune in, listen. It's not going to be a drive-through. It's going to be a slow cooker. So you have to be patient and you have to give yourself grace. And remember that there are people around you that are impacted by the choices you make. And we spend a lot of time thinking. Uh, so when we get to that point of sharing, someone's hearing something for the first time.
Hmm.
And that's true with anything. I mean, it's true with sexuality. Nobody wakes up in the morning
Yeah.
and goes, "Hey, I'm going to announce, to the
Right.
world." It usually takes a time, and we have to be patient with people. They need to process. It's the
Yeah.
same thing if you're telling somebody, listen, I'm a highly sensitive person. This is what it means. It means, you know, being on time is important to me, or having time alone is important to me. Transitions, I'm going to need a little buffer of time. I usually use those bowling bumpers,
Oh,
like
yeah.
need a little bumper. I need a
Hmm.
little bumper time here. And thank them. I appreciate your patience. I appreciate your understanding. But have that with yourself too.
Yeah.
So there is an ebb and flow, and it's not always smooth. But you get there. Um,
Yeah, you
so give
do.
yourself grace, but do it.
And I appreciate that reminder that we spend a lot of time processing, and by the time we say something out loud, we could have spent months, even years,
Yeah.
integrating something, but it would be a new piece of information for the person on the other end. And that's
Yeah.
important to remember. Give them time also. Yeah, I love that.
Right, right. A lot of times when we get there, though, it's like, okay, I'm ready. Let's go, let's go, let's go.
Right.
That's not fair to somebody else. And then we're kind of taken back by maybe their reaction. They may need time to process. It is information for them.
Yeah,
And we have to build that in as
me
well.
too.
It's good
Yeah.
for us to do that because otherwise we can get overwhelmed with their response or their reaction if we're not expecting it.
That's
So,
true.
it's a little self-serving, but the more we can be prepared, it's good for everybody involved.
It is. I appreciate that reminder. I just want to thank you so much for this conversation. Hearing your coming out story as a sensitive person has been my favorite story I've ever heard. It's just so magical, beautiful. You listen to that calling, and it happened at Kripalu, which is literally my favorite place on earth.
Oh, fantastic.
So it feels
Yes.
extra special, and just
Hmm.
how it happened, and then you and your partner were able to work through that moment together, and she was able to meet you there is really beautiful. So I'll make sure I share your book so folks can pick that up.
Thank
And
you.
yeah, of
And it's on,
course.
it was just released on audio. So it's now
Beautiful.
available as an audio book, and I was able
Wonderful.
to go in and do some editing, which made me really
Love
happy
that.
because as somebody that thinks a lot, you go back and it's like, oh, I wouldn't do that now. I had
Right.
the opportunity to go back. So the audiobook is out, which I'm very happy about
Oh, that's
because it's
exciting.
slightly edited. Yeah.
I love that. Yeah, having that chance to go back and kind of put some final touches on something, especially your own story, is so important.
Well, that's you know, the magic of it. Like in life,
Mm-hmm.
like I said, if I can go back, we don't get to go back. This
Right.
is my one opportunity to go back
Exactly.
fool around with it just a little bit, just take a
Mm-hmm.
light scalpel to it, not a hatchet. But,
Yeah. Right.
you
Now
know,
that you're a little further up that spiral staircase.
exactly. But
Yes.
how nice if we can go back in our life and take scalpels to other things.
That's right. I
But we
love it.
can't. So
For
that's
folks that are not familiar with the book, could you share a little bit more about, I mean, we talked about it a bit, but tell folks a little bit more about it.
So it opens up with my asking that question
Mm,
about am I gay, having never asked the question before. And it's really, an interesting look into what seems very obvious. Um, call it whatever you want, disassociation, just, the person in that situation doesn't know that.
right.
But it's an interesting look at how powerful the mind is and how protective the body is. That some things looking back can be so obvious,
Mm,
except to you,
right.
because your body is working really hard to keep you in a place that you've worked really hard to get to be in. And there's other people, so it's this challenge. It's you know what are you willing to do, and how how far will you go, and what's at stake, and do you keep fighting, do you give up, do you keep marching along? So
Mm-hmm.
people, the book is a coming out
Mm-hmm.
story. But lots of people have reached out to me that it resonated with them, having nothing to do with sexuality, but because
Yeah.
everyone's on some kind of journey. Everybody
Yep.
has been in a place where they have to look at themselves and go, who am I? What am I going to do with this? What's my life going to look like? So
Mm-hmm.
people that have had addiction issues, or just people that have had one string of um, bad things happening to them, career. Um, they seem to have, the book seems to speak to them
Mm-hmm.
because there's something about being resilient and surviving and
Yeah.
plowing through, even though you keep getting knocked down or you're questioning, um,
Mm-hmm.
or the messiness of it. So
Yeah.
yeah, I like when the story resonates with different people for different reasons. I
Yeah,
appreciate
it's such a universal, relatable human story.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Yeah, I
I think
agree.
so. Yes.
Well,
Um,
thank you so much for this.